I've never been keen on buying things online, but when I moved into my new apartment, I needed a couch. My budget was tight, so I turned to Craigslist. After a few days of searching, I found a listing for a beautiful, slightly used couch. The price was almost suspiciously low, but excitement got the better of me. The ad was simple: couch for sale. Excellent condition. Contact Rob. The picture showed a stylish dark gray couch, exactly what I had in mind for my living room. I messaged Rob and got a response almost immediately. He said he was moving out of town and needed to sell the couch quickly. We arranged to meet at his place the following evening. When I arrived at the address, I found myself in front of a small, run-down house on the outskirts of town. The neighborhood had an eerie quietness, made even more unsettling by the setting sun. I parked and walked up to the front door. As I knocked, a deep sense of unease crept over me. Rob answered, a tall, gaunt man with a scruffy beard and tired eyes. "You must be here for the couch," he said in a raspy voice. I nodded, and he stepped aside to let me in. The house was dim and smelled musty, as if no one had lived there for a while. Rob led me into the living room, where the couch sat exactly as pictured, maybe even better. I sat down, tested it, and was immediately sold. "I'll take it," I said, pulling out $50. Rob's eyes gleamed as he took the money. "Great. Let's get it into your car," he said. As we struggled to move the couch through the hallway, I noticed something strange. The walls were covered in newspaper clippings, all about local burglaries and home invasions. A chill ran down my spine. Why would someone plaster their walls with crime reports? Rob must have noticed me staring. "I'm a bit of a crime buff," he said quickly. "I find these stories fascinating." I forced a smile, but my instincts screamed at me to leave. Once we got the couch into my car, I thanked him and drove off, relieved to be out of there. But the unease didn't fade. The whole experience gnawed at me. A week later, I was lounging on my new couch, watching TV, when I heard footsteps coming from the kitchen. My heart pounded. I lived alone. No one should have been there. Grabbing a baseball bat, I crept toward the kitchen and flicked on the light. My blood ran cold. Rob was standing there, rummaging through my drawers. He looked up, surprised but not alarmed. Instead, he smirked. "What the hell are you doing here?" I demanded, gripping the bat tighter. Rob leaned casually against the counter. "You made it too easy," he said. "I knew where you lived. I knew you'd be alone. I've been watching you." Terror shot through me, but I forced myself to stay firm. "Get out. Now," I ordered, my voice steadier than I felt. He took a step forward. Instinct took over. I swung the bat, hitting him in the arm. He cursed and lunged. We struggled, crashing into furniture, but I managed to kick him off and run for my phone. My hands shook as I locked myself in the bathroom and called the police. Outside, I could hear him pounding on the door. The minutes stretched endlessly until sirens pierced the night. A commotion, then silence. When I finally emerged, officers were pinning Rob to the ground. He struggled, but there was nowhere left to run. Later, the police told me Rob was a wanted thief. He would sell items online, gather details about buyers, then break into their homes. The newspaper clippings in his house. Trophies from his past crimes. Even after his arrest, I couldn't shake the fear. The couch, once a perfect addition to my home, became a symbol of how close I had come to real danger. I got rid of it, unable to look at it without reliving that night. That experience changed me. I became more careful, always meeting sellers in public and never giving out my address. It was a harsh lesson. Sometimes, a bargain isn't worth the risk. Even now, when I hear an unexpected noise in the dark, I remember that terrifying encounter. A reminder that danger often hides in the most ordinary places. The intruder. It was a dark, silent night, and I was home alone, curled up on the couch, watching TV. My husband was away on a business trip, and the kids were spending the weekend at their grandparents' house. The stillness in the house felt both calming and unsettling. I liked the quiet, but an uneasy feeling lingered. Every small sound made me jump. Needing something to steady my nerves, I decided to make myself some tea. The kitchen was dimly lit, and shadows flickered on the walls as the clock ticked loudly, filling the silence with its steady rhythm. I boiled water, poured my tea, and made my way back to the living room. Just as I settled back onto the couch, a strange sound caught my attention, a faint, rhythmic scratching against the window. My pulse quickened. I tried to dismiss it as a tree branch tapping against the glass, but deep down, I knew better. Slowly, I stood and walked toward the window. As I got closer, the sound grew louder. My hands trembled as I reached for the curtain and pulled it aside. My breath caught in my throat. A shadowy figure stood outside. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by a dark mask. The sight of him sent a wave of terror through me. Before I could react, he suddenly raised his arm and smashed the window. Glass shattered everywhere. I stumbled back, losing my balance and falling to the floor. The intruder climbed through the broken window, stepping into my living room. My body refused to move, I was frozen in fear, unable to scream or even breathe. He scanned the room, his masked face turning from side to side. Then his eyes locked onto me. He stepped forward, and in the dim light, I saw the glint of a knife in his hand. "Don't move," he growled, his voice low and menacing. I nodded, too terrified to speak. He reached down, grabbed my arm, and yanked me to my feet. "Where's your money?" he demanded. I don't have much cash," I stammered. "But there's some in the kitchen drawer." Still gripping my arm, he shoved me toward the kitchen. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to move. When we reached the drawer, I opened it with trembling hands. He reached inside, grabbed the cash, and shoved it into his pocket without a second thought. Then his gaze drifted to the rest of the house. "Where else do you keep your valuables?" he asked, his voice sharp. I swallowed hard. "In the bedroom. There's some jewelry on the nightstand." Without a word, he dragged me upstairs. My heart pounded as we entered the bedroom. I pointed to the nightstand, and he rifled through the drawer, snatching up every piece of jewelry he could find. I watched helplessly as he ransacked my home, feeling more and more like a prisoner in my own house. I didn't know what else he wanted, or if he planned to hurt me. All I could do was hope he would take what he wanted and leave. Minutes passed, each one stretching into eternity. Finally, he seemed satisfied. He turned to me, his expression unreadable behind the mask. "Stay here," he ordered. "Don't move until I'm gone." Tears streamed down my face as I nodded. He stared at me for a moment longer before walking out of the bedroom. I listened as he moved downstairs, opening and closing drawers, possibly searching for more. Then, finally, the front door creaked open. I waited, barely breathing, until the house fell silent again. Only then did I find the courage to move. Creeping down the stairs, my hands shaking, I saw the front door wide open. The intruder was gone. I rushed forward, slammed the door shut, and locked it, my fingers fumbling over the deadbolt. Then I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. My voice was unsteady as I told the operator what had happened. They assured me officers were on their way. I curled up on the couch, hugging my knees, waiting for help to arrive. When the police got there, they asked me question after question. I told them everything I could remember, the way he moved, the sound of his voice, the items he stole. They searched the house for evidence, and though their presence made me feel a little safer, the fear still clung to me. A few days later, the police called with news. They had caught him. He had been arrested while trying to sell the jewelry he had stolen from my house. As it turned out, he had a long criminal record and had been involved in multiple burglaries in the area. This time, though, he wouldn't be getting away. Even now, I still feel uneasy when I'm home alone, especially at night. The memory of that terrifying encounter lingers, a shadow that won't fully disappear. But I'm grateful the police caught him. Now, I double-check every lock before going to bed. I never take my home security for granted. Because once danger finds its way inside, it's impossible to forget how vulnerable you really are. Mark. In college, I met Mark, a guy who could light up any room with his humor and effortless charm. He was always cracking jokes, organizing parties, and making sure everyone had a good time. We became close friends quickly. People gravitated toward him, but beneath that easygoing exterior, there was something about him that felt off. A mystery I couldn't quite put my finger on. One night, after a party at his place, I stepped outside and saw Mark in a heated argument with someone. Though I couldn't make out their words, the tension between them was thick. The next day, I asked him about it, but he waved it off, claiming it was just a misunderstanding. Over time, I started noticing more strange things. Mark would vanish for days without any warning. If anyone asked, he'd say he was visiting family or taking an impulsive trip, but he never invited anyone along. Something wasn't adding up. Then, one day, I was scrolling through the news when a particular headline caught my attention: a robbery at a local bank. As I read through the article, my stomach dropped. The surveillance footage showed a masked figure, but something about him, his build, the way he moved, felt eerily familiar. It looked just like Mark. Dread settled in as I stared at the images. Could it really be him? The idea was too insane to believe, but at the same time, I couldn't ignore the resemblance. With my heart pounding, I confronted Mark. My hands trembled as I shoved my phone in his face, showing him the article. At first, he laughed, brushing it off as a ridiculous coincidence. But then, as I pressed him further, his expression changed. The easy charm drained from his face, replaced by something darker. Finally, he admitted it. He told me he'd gotten involved in some shady stuff to make ends meet. Said he was drowning in debt and had no other choice. He insisted he wasn't a bad person, that he just made a few mistakes. He promised he was trying to turn his life around. But all I felt was fear. I had trusted him. Considered him a friend. And now, I was looking at someone who was tied up in things I didn't want to understand. What if he got caught? What if I got dragged into it? I started pulling away. I stopped answering his calls and ignored his messages. The guilt ate at me, but I couldn't risk being linked to whatever trouble he was in. Months passed, and I focused on school, trying to move forward. But Mark's name still surfaced in whispers. There were rumors, talk of other crimes, of him getting deeper into the kind of life you don't come back from. It seemed like he was slipping further into the darkness. Then, one night, my phone rang. It was Mark. His voice was frantic, panicked. He begged me to meet him, said he needed my help. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at a deserted park on the outskirts of town. The moment I saw him, I barely recognized him. He looked wrecked, his face gaunt, his hands trembling. There was raw desperation in his eyes. He told me he was in danger. That some very bad people were after him, people he owed money to. He begged me to hide him, just for a few days. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to walk away. But when I saw the sheer terror on his face, I couldn't. I took him in. For the next few days, my life was filled with paranoia. Every noise outside made me jump. Every shadow felt like a threat. Mark barely spoke, spending most of his time peering through the window like a hunted animal. Then, one evening, I came home from class to find my apartment door ajar. A cold wave of panic surged through me. I stepped inside cautiously. The place was in ruins, furniture overturned, drawers emptied, belongings scattered across the floor. And Mark was gone. I stood there in stunned silence, my mind racing. I had let a criminal into my life, into my home, and now he had vanished, along with who knew what else. With shaking hands, I called the police. The investigation that followed was relentless. They questioned me for hours about Mark, his whereabouts, his connections. They searched my apartment for clues, but it was clear, Mark had covered his tracks. He had used me as a temporary escape and then disappeared like a ghost. Weeks passed. Then months. Eventually, life returned to some version of normal. The fear faded, though it never completely left. I never heard from Mark again, and a part of me was relieved. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside and the shadows stretch long across my walls, I think about him. I remember the fear in his eyes that night in the park. And I wonder where he is now. What kind of life he's living. And I pray that our paths never cross again. James. Watching horror movies. One dark and stormy night, I decided to revisit one of my favorite horror films. Outside, the rain poured relentlessly, and the wind howled like a restless spirit. Alone in the house, I curled up on the couch with a big bowl of popcorn, letting the eerie atmosphere add to the tension of the movie. Every little noise made me jump. The house was old, its wooden frame creaking with the shifting wind. I pulled my blanket tighter around me, trying to focus on the screen. Then, I heard it. A loud knock. It came from the basement. My heart skipped a beat. I paused the movie and listened, holding my breath. At first, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. But then it happened again, this time louder and more deliberate. A chill crawled up my spine. I was alone. No one ever went into the basement, it was a cold, damp space filled with forgotten things. I took a deep breath, forcing logic over fear. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe the old pipes were rattling. But deep down, I knew better. Summoning every ounce of courage, I stood and walked to the basement door. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob. The air around it felt noticeably colder. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Slowly, I turned the knob and opened the door. Darkness yawned before me. The basement light switch was just inside. I flicked it on, and for a moment, the bulb flickered uncertainly before casting a weak, yellow glow down the wooden stairs. I hesitated before stepping forward. Each step creaked loudly, echoing in the heavy silence. The basement smelled of old wood and dust, an undisturbed space frozen in time. Everything seemed normal, boxes stacked against the walls, furniture draped in white sheets. Then, the knocking came again. This time, it was right behind me. I spun around, my breath hitching. Nothing. No one. My heart pounded as I scanned the room, trying to make sense of what was happening. The sound had come from the far corner, where an old wooden cabinet stood against the wall. It had always been there, but I had never paid much attention to it before. Covered in dust and cobwebs, it looked ancient, as if it hadn't been touched in years. With shaking hands, I approached it. The knocking had stopped, but the air felt thick, oppressive. I reached out, hesitating before grasping the handle. The hinges groaned loudly as I pulled the door open. Inside, there was nothing. Except for an old, tattered book. It sat alone on the bottom shelf, its leather cover cracked with age. Carefully, I picked it up and blew away the thick layer of dust. There were no markings on the outside, just a plain, brown cover. I opened it, revealing yellowed pages filled with slanted, faded handwriting. It was a diary. As I read through the first few entries, a sinking feeling settled in my stomach. The diary belonged to someone who had lived in this house long ago. They wrote about strange noises, knocking, whispers, an unshakable feeling of being watched. The last entry made my blood run cold. The knocking is getting louder. I fear something is trying to get out. Suddenly, the basement light flickered violently before going out completely. Darkness swallowed me whole. I gasped, my fingers loosening, and the book tumbled to the floor. Fumbling, I yanked out my phone and switched on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, but it did little to ease the suffocating fear pressing down on me. Then, the knocking started again. This time, it came from the walls. Louder. More insistent. I didn't wait. Grabbing the book, I bolted up the stairs, taking them two at a time. The knocking followed me, growing more frantic, as if something was desperately trying to escape. I burst through the door and slammed it shut, leaning against it, gasping for breath. Silence. I stood there, shaking, trying to calm my racing heart. Back in the living room, I dropped the book onto the coffee table and sank into the couch, wrapping my arms around myself. I needed to hear another voice. I reached for my phone to call my friend Mark, someone who always had a logical explanation for everything. But just as my fingers touched the screen, the power went out. Pitch darkness. The wind howled outside. The rain lashed against the windows. My phone screen flickered, showing no signal. I was completely alone. Then the knocking resumed. Not just from the basement. It was everywhere, echoing through the walls, coming from inside the house. It surrounded me, growing louder, more desperate. Something wasn't trying to get in. Something was trying to get out. I clutched the book, feeling as if it was the only link to whatever was happening. I wanted to run. To leave. But I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The power flickered back on. The lights buzzed to life. The house was silent again, except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. I never found out what caused the knocking that night. Maybe my imagination had run wild, fueled by the horror movie, the storm, and the eerie old house. Or maybe something in the basement had been locked away for a reason. I never went down there again. And I returned the book to the cabinet, hoping to forget about it. But even now, on quiet nights when the wind howls outside, I still hear it. A faint, rhythmic knocking. Coming from deep within the walls. John. In 2003, I found myself in need of a roommate. Living alone in my small apartment was becoming too expensive, so I decided to find someone to split the rent. I posted an ad on Craigslist, hoping to find someone normal, just an average person looking for a place to stay. A few days later, I received a response from a guy named John Williams. He seemed nice over email, polite and to the point. He needed a place quickly, which worked out perfectly for both of us. When we met in person, he looked completely ordinary, just a regular guy in his late 20s. Nothing about him set off alarms, so I figured this arrangement would work. John moved in almost immediately, and at first, everything seemed fine. Because of our opposite schedules, me working during the day and him working at night, we rarely crossed paths. Our interactions were short, usually just a quick chat in the morning or late at night. He was quiet, kept to himself, and never caused any problems. It was an easy arrangement. Or so I thought. After a few weeks, little things started to feel off. John was hardly ever home. Sometimes, he would vanish for days without any explanation. When he did return, he looked exhausted, tense, like he hadn't slept in days. I figured he had a demanding job or personal issues, and since I wasn't the type to pry, I let it go. Then, something strange happened. One day, I found my mail in the trash. It had been torn into tiny pieces. Confused and irritated, I asked John if he had seen anyone near our mailbox, but he just shrugged and said no. His indifference didn't sit right with me, but I had no proof that he was involved. A few days later, I noticed that John's bedroom door was always locked. That was odd. He had never mentioned keeping anything valuable in there, so why the secrecy? My curiosity grew stronger, gnawing at me day by day. Then, one weekend, John left again. This time, I couldn't ignore my instincts. I broke into his room. I knew it was wrong, but I needed to know what was going on. Using a screwdriver, I carefully picked the lock and pushed the door open. At first glance, the room looked normal, just a typical bedroom. But then, I noticed a folder on his desk. When I opened it, my stomach dropped. Inside were shredded pieces of my mail, documents with my personal information, and a diary. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages. It wasn't just a journal, it was a log. John had been keeping detailed notes about me. He wrote about my daily routines, my friends, even my family. It was like he had been watching me constantly, documenting my every move. Then I saw the entry that froze me in place. Brian is getting suspicious. I need to be more careful. A cold wave of fear ran through me. Who was this guy? Who had I been living with? I grabbed my laptop and started searching for his name, John Williams. Nothing unusual came up. But then, I noticed another name written multiple times in his diary, Dino Lauren Smith. When I looked it up, my blood ran cold. Dino Lauren Smith was a wanted jewel thief with a long criminal record. His name was all over the news. There was even a photo. It was John. My hands shook as I picked up my phone and dialed the police. When they answered, I told them everything. They asked me to bring the evidence to the station, so I packed the folder and rushed out of the apartment. At the police station, I handed over everything and recounted the entire story. The officers checked their records, and what they told me was both a relief and a new kind of terror. Dino Lauren Smith had been arrested just a few days earlier. He was already in custody. I let out a shaky breath, realizing I wasn't in immediate danger. But that relief was quickly overshadowed by another thought: how close I had been to a dangerous criminal. What if he had stolen my identity? What if he had hurt me? The police assured me I was safe but advised me to change all my passwords, monitor my financial accounts, and stay alert. I took their advice seriously, securing everything I could. Over the next few days, I scrubbed every trace of him from my apartment. I threw out everything he left behind, changed the locks, and even installed a security system. I wanted no reminders of the person I had unknowingly lived with. Years have passed since that experience, but it still lingers in my mind. What started as a simple Craigslist roommate search turned into a nightmare. If something feels wrong, it probably is. I never saw or heard from John, Dino, again. But to this day, when people ask me about my craziest roommate story, I tell them about the time I unknowingly lived with a wanted jewel thief. Even now, just thinking about it gives me chills. Maple Inn. For years, I worked the night shift at the Maple Inn, a small, rundown motel on the outskirts of town. The job was usually quiet, almost boring. Most nights, I passed the time watching TV or flipping through old magazines left behind by guests. But one night, something happened that I'll never forget. It was a Tuesday, and the motel was nearly empty. Only 2 rooms were occupied, one by an elderly couple passing through town and the other by a truck driver who had checked in late that evening. The clock on the wall read 1:15 a.m. as I fought to stay awake. The flickering fluorescent lights above the front desk did little to help my fatigue. The only sound in the lobby was the steady hum of the vending machine in the corner. Then, out of nowhere, the front door burst open with a loud bang. A man stumbled in, looking frantic and disheveled. His clothes were dirty, his hair unkempt, and his wide, darting eyes sent an instant wave of unease through me. He rushed to the front desk, slamming his hands down so hard that I flinched. "Please, I need a room," he gasped, glancing over his shoulder like someone was chasing him. His voice was strained, filled with urgency. Swallowing my nerves, I forced my voice to stay steady. Sure. Do you have a reservation?" He shook his head furiously. "No. No reservation. I just need a room. Right now." Something about the way he looked, the way he spoke, it put me on edge. But I nodded and grabbed a key from the rack behind me. "Room 105, down the hall to your left." He snatched the key from my hand and hurried away, not even waiting for any formalities or paperwork. I watched him disappear into his room, my heart pounding. Something about him filled me with a deep sense of dread, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. After he vanished, I tried to refocus on the TV, but my mind kept drifting back to the stranger. Who was he running from? What had him so scared? To settle my nerves, I turned my attention to the security monitors. The screens showed the empty hallways and the parking lot. The truck driver had gone to bed, and the elderly couple hadn't left their room all night. Everything seemed normal. Until 2:30 a.m. That's when I saw him again. The man from room 105 was standing outside his door, pacing. His movements were jittery, frantic. He kept glancing toward the lobby, as if checking for something, or someone. I was about to go check on him when he suddenly stopped. And looked directly at one of the security cameras. For a moment, I felt like he was staring straight at me. His eyes were wide, wild, filled with something I couldn't quite name, fear, desperation, something worse. Then, without warning, he turned and bolted down the hallway toward the back exit. I watched the monitor as he disappeared into the night. A cold chill ran down my spine. I waited, expecting him to return. He never did. After a few tense minutes, I decided to call the police. The dispatcher listened carefully as I explained what had happened. "We'll send someone to check it out," they assured me. 20 minutes later, 2 officers arrived. I let them in and showed them the security footage. They watched the video carefully, nodding as they took notes. "Do you have any idea who he is?" one of the officers asked. I shook my head. "No. He just showed up out of nowhere. Seemed terrified of something." The officers exchanged a glance. "We'll check his room," one of them said. "Stay here." I watched as they made their way down the hall toward room 105, guns drawn. My heart pounded as they knocked on the door before cautiously stepping inside. A few minutes later, they returned. Their expressions were puzzled. "There's no one in the room," one of them said. My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "I saw him go in there. He never came back out until I saw him on the cameras." The officers nodded. "We believe you. We'll do a sweep of the area. Keep your doors locked, and call us if you see anything else." They left to search the motel grounds. I locked the front door and sat back down at the desk, feeling more uneasy than ever. Time crawled by. Every little noise made me jump. I kept glancing at the security monitors, half expecting to see those wild eyes staring back at me again. At 4 a.m., the officers returned. Nothing. They hadn't found a single trace of the man. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. They took my statement and promised to keep an eye on the area. Then they left, and I was alone again. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion. When morning finally came, I was relieved to see the sun rising. As soon as the day shift worker arrived, I filled them in on what had happened and left the motel as fast as I could. The bright sunlight did little to ease my nerves. Even now, months later, I still think about that night. The police never found any sign of the man. No one ever came looking for him. It was like he had simply disappeared. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls and the motel sits quiet and empty, I remember the way he stared into the camera. And I wonder if he's still out there, running from whatever terror drove him to the Maple Inn. Running from whatever. Inn. I had been driving for hours on that lonely highway, surrounded by nothing but darkness and silence. The soft hum of the engine and the occasional flicker of road signs were my only company. It was past midnight, and exhaustion weighed heavy on me. I longed for the comfort of my bed, but the road ahead stretched endlessly into the horizon, empty and unchanging. A strange unease settled over me. It was as if something unseen was watching from the shadows beyond the reach of my headlights. I shook it off, blaming the fatigue and the eerie stillness of the deserted road. Then, up ahead, my headlights caught something, a figure standing by the side of the road. A man. He was dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by the shadows cast from the trees lining the highway. My hands tightened on the wheel as I hesitated. What was he doing out here, in the middle of nowhere, at this hour? As I approached, my pulse quickened. Something about him wasn't right. He made no move to flag me down, no gesture for help, he simply stood there, waiting. The air in the car felt heavier. Slowing down slightly, I kept my eyes locked on him as I passed. Then, just as I was about to drive by, he turned his head. Slowly. His gaze followed my car, locking onto me with an intensity that sent ice through my veins. His eyes gleamed unnaturally in the dim light, piercing through the darkness. He wasn't just standing there. He was waiting. A cold wave of fear crashed over me, an instinct deep in my gut screaming at me to get away. I pressed my foot down on the gas, trying to put distance between myself and the figure. Then, in my rearview mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. He had started walking. Slow, deliberate steps, yet disturbingly steady. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. Maybe he was stranded, maybe he needed help. But deep down, I knew better. I glanced at the mirror again, and my breath caught in my throat. He was running now. Fast. Faster than I thought possible. Panic surged through me. He wasn't looking for help. He was hunting. My tires screeched against the pavement as I swerved around a bend, my hands gripping the wheel with white-knuckled desperation. My mind raced with possibilities. Should I call for help? Try to lose him on these twisting, unfamiliar roads? But my phone had no signal, and the highway stretched on, a black void swallowing everything ahead of me. I could feel him behind me, his presence like a shadow creeping closer. I floored the gas pedal, heart pounding as I searched frantically for any sign of civilization. A gas station, a diner, anything, somewhere I could find refuge from this nightmare. Then, finally, in the distance, a faint glow. Lights. A gas station. Relief flooded through me as I veered toward it, my only hope of escape. The parking lot was empty, but I didn't care, I just needed to be somewhere, anywhere, other than alone on that road. As I pulled in, I stole one last glance at the mirror. He was gone. Shaking, I stumbled out of my car and into the gas station. The attendant behind the counter looked at me with concern as I tried to explain what had happened, my words coming out in broken gasps. But when we stepped outside to check, there was nothing. No footprints. No sign of anyone on the road. The police arrived shortly after. I gave them a description of the man, though deep down, I already knew the truth. They wouldn't find him. Because he wasn't just a man. He was something else, something that had appeared from nowhere and vanished just as quickly. That night on the empty highway, I learned a chilling truth. Sometimes, the darkest terrors aren't lurking in haunted houses or deep in the woods. Sometimes, they find you when you're all alone, surrounded by nothing but the vast, endless road. Home alone. Places. I never liked being home alone, but that night was different. My parents had gone to visit my aunt, leaving me by myself for the first time in years. They trusted me, said I was old enough, that nothing would happen. But the moment they left, a cold shiver ran down my spine. The house was too quiet. I could hear every creak of the floorboards, every rustling leaf outside. The silence wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. I tried to distract myself, turning on the TV to my favorite show, but no matter how loud I made it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Needing something to do, I went to the kitchen to make popcorn. The microwave hummed, filling the room with the familiar scent of butter, and for a moment, I felt a little better. I grabbed the warm bowl and returned to the living room. Then, I heard it. A whisper. Soft. Faint. I froze. Is someone there? I called out, my voice unsteady. No answer. I let out a nervous laugh, trying to convince myself I was just imagining things. I turned the volume up, hoping to drown out the unsettling quiet. But then the whisper came again. Louder this time. Who's there? I shouted, standing up. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone, my first instinct to call my parents. But then I stopped. They'd tell me I was being silly, that it was just the house settling. Maybe they were right. I decided to check the house instead. Moving slowly down the hallway, I stepped carefully, the floorboards groaning beneath me. The TV cast long, shifting shadows against the walls, distorting shapes that made my pulse quicken. I checked each room, turning on the lights as I went. Nothing. Everything was exactly as it should be. Then I reached the end of the hallway. The basement door was open. Just slightly. I never went down there. It was always cold, damp, filled with forgotten things buried in dust and time. I swallowed hard, pressing my hand against the door. It felt colder than the rest of the house. I took a deep breath and pushed it open. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the air growing heavier with each step. At the bottom, I reached for the light switch, flipping it on. A weak glow flickered to life, casting dim illumination across the room. The basement was empty. Just as I had expected. But then. The whisper. Right behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. My eyes darted wildly, searching the room. And then I saw it. In the far corner stood an old mirror, its surface streaked with dust and speckled with cracks. I had never paid much attention to it before, but now, something about it sent a wave of unease through me. Slowly, I walked toward it, wiping the dust away with my sleeve. My own reflection stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed. Then, behind me, something moved. A shadow. Dark. Shapeless. Looming. My stomach twisted in terror. I whirled around. But there was nothing there. The basement was still empty. My feet moved before my mind caught up. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. My fingers fumbled with the lock, twisting it until I was sure nothing could get through. I leaned against the door, gasping for breath. I knew something had been down there. Something had seen me. I staggered back into the living room, grabbing my phone. I needed to call someone, anyone, but when I looked at the screen, my stomach dropped. No signal. The bars were gone. The screen flickered. Then. The whisper. Right behind me. I turned around slowly. And there it was. A shadow. Dark. Menacing. Standing in the doorway. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. It didn't walk, it glided across the floor, reaching out. Its fingers, long and twisted, stretched toward me. The air around me turned ice cold as I felt its grip wrap around my arm. I screamed. With all my strength, I tore myself free and stumbled toward the front door. My hands shook violently as I fumbled with the lock, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it might explode. Finally, the door flew open. I ran. I sprinted down the street, my lungs burning, my ears ringing with the sound of my own ragged breaths. I didn't stop until I reached my neighbor's house. I pounded on their door, my hands shaking, barely able to form words when they finally opened it. Their faces filled with concern as I gasped out my story. They let me in, comforting me as they called my parents and the police. When the officers arrived, they searched the house. They found nothing. No intruder. No signs of forced entry. No shadow. They told me I had imagined it. That I had let my fear get the best of me. But I knew the truth. Something had been in that house with me. Something dark. Something that whispered. My parents did their best to reassure me, promising that everything was fine. That I was safe. But I never stayed home alone again. The memory of that night still haunts me. Even now, in the dead of night, when the wind whispers through the cracks of my window, I hear it. That soft, haunting voice. And I know. I was never alone that night. And I never will be again.